back to the land, but now he's got Esau to deal with. And Jacob is afraid as he learns of the great forces that Esau has, and his guilty conscience makes him believe the worst and think the worst. And so he begins to plan, but he prays as well, and then he plans some more. It's actually this kind of cycle where it's like plan, pray, plan, and it goes back and forth. Let me just give you an overview of chapters 32 and 33, because they kind of go together. Because he's returning to the land, he's going to meet with Esau, but before he does, he meets with God, and then he meets with Esau. So if you look at chapter 32, and just the verses we read, 1 to 21, you could just call it the return. He's returning to the land, and this is kind of getting at some of the things he goes through as he is preparing to meet Esau as he returns. And then we could call the second half of chapter 32 renaming in verses 22 to 32. And that's when in that wrestling with God, God changes his name from Jacob to Israel. And then in chapter 33, we'll call it reconciliation, where Jacob and Esau actually meet, and it's not what Jacob expected, and they are able to reconcile despite being away for many, many years. So we want to look at this first part of the return, and there are a number of sections here, and it's just amazing to see the way Moses uses key words or brackets to set things apart for us and make his points clear. Really, 1 to 8, verses 1 to 8 are a section, and there's an emphasis on messengers and 2 camps. Okay, so let me just point some of these things out structurally before we get into the text. You'll notice that in verse 1 it says the angels of God met him, and anyone's translations say messengers in verse. Anyone have anything besides ESV? Okay, Mike has LSV. What do you got? Messengers. Okay, in verse 1. NASB. Okay, NASB has it. And then notice verse 3. Jacob sent messengers. So here's kind of the same word, and ESV translates it because they're trying to show that these are different. Like they're trying to show that Jacob didn't send angels to Esau, but it's actually the same word because angel just kind of means messenger. And so God sends messengers to Jacob, and then Jacob sends messengers to Esau. And one is angelic, the first is angelic, the second is human. And then you have the naming of the place in verse 2, Mahanaim, which is like 2 camps. And then we see at the end of verse 7 that when Jacob hears about his brother's forces, he splits his camp into 2 camps. And so there's kind of these 2 things going on, the emphasis on messengers and the emphasis on 2 camps, kind of Moses' way to pack these together in one section. And then, of course, you have the prayer section in verses 9 to 12, where he prays. That's focused there on his prayer. And then in verses 13 to 21, you have a key word that's emphasized that's a little bit harder to see in English, but it's the word face. And it appears, there's one word, so let's just nerd out for a second here. Most Hebrew words have a 3-letter root, consonantal root, so 3 consonants, and that's what makes up the essence of most words. And so there are some words that have the same consonants, but they have different vowels that go with it, and so they're different. But there is a word that it's translated as ahead in ESV. So in verse 16, pass on ahead of me. Verse 17, and whose are these ahead of you? And that's right. That's the right way to translate it. But it actually has the same 3-letter root as the word for face. And so like 7 times in this last section that we're going to look at, this 3-letter consonantal word, it sounds the same. So you just, as you read it in Hebrew, it's like you just hear panim, 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 and you hear it over and over again. And there's kind of a wordplay in verses 20 and 21 where it says in verse 20, for he thought I may appease him. And it's this way of, in fact, ESV even has a little footnote. It says appease his face. And then with the present that goes ahead, and that's that other root, ahead of me, and afterwards I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me, or he will lift up my face. And so there's this heavy emphasis in this other section on the word face. And so we'll look at that in a minute. So that's just kind of the structural side of it. And then in verse 22 to 32, you see it's marked off as well. Verse 22 just says that the same night. So it's just highlighting, okay, let's zoom in on this night. And then you see, of course, the key word is the name. You have Jacob, it gets emphasized, and then Israel. So God is asking, what is your name? And he says, Jacob, kind of an indication of his identity. And then he gets renamed. So that's kind of the structural setup for that. So let's look at these verses and just put some more applicational headings for us as we walk through it. In verses 1 and 2, we'll call it the assurances we often receive for the future. The assurances we often receive for the future. And let's look there again. Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. So he called the name of that place Mahanaim. So where is this? Where is Jacob? So he's coming from Haran. This is on the east side of the Jordan River. So if I were to turn around here, and you have the Mediterranean Sea is over here, okay, and then you have the Sea of Galilee is here, and then the Jordan River comes down. There's the Dead Sea here. Well, over here, Jacob is coming down like this, and he's east of the Jordan River, and he's nearing the Jordan River, and he's getting closer and closer. So that's where he's coming. Now, so if we keep up with that, so Mediterranean, Israel, the Jordan River, he's coming in here. Where's Edom and where does Esau live? He lives down here. He lives down south by the Dead Sea. So think about it geographically, okay? Did y'all follow that? I'm going to see what it's doing. All right, good. Couldn't see your faces. What might that tell you? Just think geographically. Okay, he's coming into the land, and he's trying to enter. He's ultimately going to come by the Jordan, cross there. What would that tell you about this interaction with Esau? Yeah, right. So it doesn't quite fit. He doesn't. You could say it like this: he doesn't have to go down that way, right? He could just slip in, and no one would know, right? So that's interesting. What does that tell us? Appreciate your honesty. Yeah, right? Yeah. So geographically, it seems like the text is hinting at us that there's a real desire to make this right with Esau. And of course, we'll see that in chapter 33 as well. But geographically, he doesn't have to send messengers down to Esau. He could very well just slip into the land. But no, he's wanting to do that. So that's kind of where, you don't always see that, but where geography is helpful. And actually, there's a few study Bibles, like, I don't know, maybe it's ESV, they have a map. And so you could actually see like the journey. Oh, you have it. So what do you have? MacArthur. So they have a map there where you can see his journey in. And if you know where Seir is and where the Edomites live, then you realize that. So anyway, we see that that's where he is. That's where he's coming. Now, it says, the angels came and met Jacob. Now, there's a number of connections just in these first two verses that connect us back to chapter 28. So, for instance, this idea of messengers, the messengers of God or the angels of God, it's a distinctive term, actually. And it only occurs here and in chapter 28. Okay, and so pop quiz, what happened in Jacob's life in chapter 28 with angels? The staircase, yeah. You have the staircase. So he has, it's Bethel, right? And he names it Bethel because it's the house of God. And he puts his head on a rock and for his pillow. And then he sees the staircase and angels are ascending and descending upon it. And so there he saw this assurance of God's access and his presence there at Bethel. And now the exact same phrase, it's almost like Moses is bracketing in Jacob's life, his leaving the land is accompanied by this vision of angels, and his returning to the land is accompanied by a vision of these angels as well. So very distinct way of speaking. Then this term met him is also used in chapter 28, verse 11. And then the naming of the places. You have, after the incident, right, he says, this place is Bethel, and then here, Mahanaim. So there's a naming. So there's a lot of connections back to chapter 28 that the author wants you to make. And you have this interesting word, and the ESV helps us with the little footnote there, that Mahanaim might mean two camps. And, there's a little ambiguity. You're like, what are the two camps? And it seems like the two camps are the angels' camp and Jacob's camp. It's like God's camp, Jacob's camp. And I think it's meant to be an assurance for him, just like chapter 28 was. God revealed his word to Jacob in chapter 28 as he's leaving the land. And God is reminding him of his word in chapter 28 and of his power and of his presence through these angels yet again. So that's what you have here. Now, can you think of another story in the Old Testament where angels prove to be an encouragement to those in a difficult situation? I'm going to flip there and see if you get there before I do. Better hurry. It's in the book of Kings. What? Hezekiah. Well, yeah, the angel of Yahweh comes and wrecks the Assyrians. That's true. Yeah, the angel of Yahweh appears before Joshua, but I'm talking about just angels in general. So in 2 Kings chapter 6, yeah, here we go. So, yep. So the servant of Elisha is with him, and it says, let's see, verse 15, chapter 6, when the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out. I love this story. It's like, this is how I picture, I know this is not how it happened, but I picture that the servant's in the house and there's a screen door, so it's like a little country, and he's got his like coffee and his steam's coming off that, and he kind of pushes open. There's a little squeak at the screen door, and he walks out, and he's like, got his bathrobe on, and he's going to pick up the newspaper, and then all of a sudden, okay, let's pick it up. Behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. And so it's like, oh, okay, looks up, spills his coffee, something like that. I don't know. And the servant said, alas, my master, what shall we do? Verse 16, he said, do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Then Elisha prayed and said, O Yahweh, please open his eyes that he may see. So Yahweh opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all round Elisha. And then, of course, this is a great story because it ends, that Elisha basically leads them to the enemy camp. And he's like, hey, come follow me this way. And they take him there. And then the king said, what do we do? Do we kill them all? He's like, no, let's feed them, and send them home. So interesting. But yeah, what an encouragement that was to this servant who was terrified until he saw the help that was there. And that's what's happening here. As he enters back into the land, here comes these angels, these messengers that God sends to him in a way that reminds him of that past revelation that he had. And before this crisis, God is bringing him assurance, bringing him comfort. His presence is emphasized for Jacob. And so, yes, we're not Jacob, and God doesn't, make angels appear for us. Though certainly there are angels that are working on behalf of those who will inherit eternal life. But I think the bigger overarching principle here is that you think, how is God assuring Jacob? Well, he's taking him back to something, reminding him of something else that happened in his life where the revelation of God was given. So I think generally we might say God assures him through his past word as he reminds him, as these angels, and he reminds him of his present power and of his presence as he enters in. And so all true things for us as well. That before, and it's amazing, the assurances God brings to us even before we know we need it. And he reminds us of some past promise, some past truth that stabilizes us for what we're about to go through. And that's, I think, what God is doing here graciously for Jacob. He's reminding him of his presence. He's reminding him that he's for Jacob. Think of Romans 8:31. If God is for us, who can be against us? And so here's a way for Jacob to know, hey, I'm with you. These angels are here. They're reminding you of what God did in the past. So the assurances we often receive for the future. Secondly, we'll look at the apprehensions we often have. The apprehensions we often have. So verse 3 picks out, look at verse 3 to 5. And Jacob sent messengers, so there's that kind of play on words there. Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, female servants. I have sent to tell my Lord in order that I may find favor in your sight. Now, what stands out to you here in the way that he tells his messengers to address Esau? What's that? Yeah, he calls him Lord, and how does he refer to himself? Servant, yeah. So this is what does that tell you about Jacob? Yeah, he's coming humbly. And to refer this way to his brother, he seems to be seeking to truly want to reconcile here. So he's coming humbly. He seeks favor in Esau's sight. And he reminds him, he kind of gives him some of the basic facts, the cliff notes of what is going on, why he's returning, where he's been, sojourned with Laban, and stayed until now, and then what he has, oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, female servants, and then what he wants in order that I might find favor in your sight. So, and look at verses 6 to 8. And the messengers returned to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him. And Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He divided the people who were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two camps, thinking, if Esau comes to one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. So the messengers return with a message from Esau, and there is quite a few of them, 400 of them. Now, what would that tell? What does the text not say about this, that Jacob infers? That they're aggressive, yeah. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know why, there's all these guys, but, the proverb, what is it? The guilty flee when no one is pursuing. And there's a famous story. I can't remember who it was that did this, but some famous novel writer, sent a letter to like 4 or 5 of his friends that said, like, all is known, flee at once. And they all laughed down. And he just totally made it up because they all had guilty consciences and they thought the worst. They were like, they know. And this friend of his didn't know anything that was wrong in their life, but he was just playing a prank and it totally worked. And that's kind of Jacob here. He's so afraid of his brother and what might happen. And so remember though, back in chapter 27, if you turn there, 27:41. This is the last time they saw each other. As Jacob is walking out of the house dressed like Esau, and Esau was like, "That's kind of weird. Why is he all hairy like that?" I was like, and he walks away, and he's walking in with all of his meat. Okay, so verse 41, chapter 27. Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." But the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, "Behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you." And then she sends him off. So, yeah, that's the last he had heard of Esau. And so he puts it together. Now, this, like, Abraham had less troops than this when he went to fight the other kings in chapter 14. So it's the other time we have like a mention of how many troops someone has. And so Esau has more troops than Abraham had. They both prospered greatly in the time away, a time of 20 years. And so it's really, the text is ambiguous as to what Esau's intentions are. But if you have a past like Esau, you could jump to conclusions and fear the worst. And the text says he was greatly afraid. And so he divides his people into two. And basically he thinks, okay, if they get half of us, then the rest of us can still escape. And so he's going to sacrifice potentially half of his people. And so he's planning. So we saw God comes, assures him. He plans, then he prays, and then he'll plan again. And commentators, go back and forth, is he being wise here? Is he just planning for the future? And this is, not an act of faithlessness and whatever. I think it's a little less clear here than it is in the second part, as we'll see. But he is trying to preserve himself in some way. And so here, the simple point is, though, the apprehensions we often have. There are so many times in our lives when we fear things greatly that never happen, that never come to pass. We project out and we think we know exactly how it's going to play out and what people's intentions are and everything and what that will mean for us. And then we just spin this web of fear in our hearts, and it all never happens. And that's exactly what we're going to see with Esau, or with Jacob, as they eventually meet. And none of these things, they're all unfounded. And of course, he's just been given assurance from God, and yet here he is greatly afraid. And yet there's a realism about this that is comforting to us, right? This is not just like a beat you down kind of thing, but to see that the life of faith is often punctuated with this back and forth of we believe, we're assured by God and his word, and then we start to fear again, and then we're brought back, and then we start to fear again, and we just live this back and forth. So it is a all too common experience for us. It doesn't mean we don't fight against it, but there's just a realism about the text here that as the circumstances get back in his face, he begins to worry. And God does not often keep us from threatening circumstances, but is present with us in the midst of them. Then this leads to what I think is really the highlight of this first section of the chapter, is the acknowledgement we always need. The acknowledgement we always need as he prays in verses 9 to 12. And look at this prayer. Let's read this prayer. Just a few comments before we read it. Jacob has not been an example of prayer up to this point. In fact, Jacob hasn't prayed at all up to this point in the narrative. Of course, he may have prayed, but the text doesn't record anything. But what we find is that this is the longest prayer in Genesis of an individual. And so now he prays. And it's really, in some ways, a model prayer. So let's read it. Verse 9. Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, O Yahweh, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. All right, let's just pull over for a second and think about this prayer. And just let's make some observations together about lessons from prayer, from the first prayer of Jacob in his distress. What are some good takeaways from this model prayer? Things you notice. Yeah, he recognizes God. Where do you see that in the text specifically? A couple ways, right? What's that? Yeah, he addresses God in a number of ways, right? Yeah, so, yep, connecting that. Yeah.
He says, you're the God of my father, Abraham. So it's like generational. They've been teaching him.
Yeah. Yep. The way he refers to God is connecting to the past. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so he does it twice in verse 9. Return to your country. You said, return to your country, your kindred, that I may do you good. And then the end of at verse 12, and you said, I will surely do you good. Make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Yeah, so he reminds God of his promise. Yep, he's humbling himself. Verse 10, not worthy of the least of the deeds of steadfast love, all the faithfulness that you've shown your servant.
For us today, it tells me to pray scripture.
Yes, yeah. Yep, absolutely. You're praying according to God's will if you pray scripture, right?
And he says, I fear him. I'm just scared.
Yeah.
Help me.
Yeah. Yeah, what do you love about that? What about Jacob here? Yeah. He's raw, candor. It is not flowery. It's just simple, clear. I'm afraid of my brother that he's going to kill me. Like, that's just simple. And it's exactly what he's thinking. And you just got to love that. You just got to love the candor that he has and the freedom that he feels to just say what's on his heart before the Lord. So I love that part. But what else?
Somebody mentioned the humility, but just, I am not worthy.
Yeah.
Think of the song that calls us a worm. That's not a normal human activity. Anytime you see that kind of humility in a human, that's otherworldly.
Yeah. God is working on him.
Yeah.
Getting him there. Yeah. He's thankful, right? At the end of verse 10, for with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I've become two camps. I mean, there's an acknowledgement of all the ways that God has blessed him. So there's even thankfulness in this prayer. Really good. We're squeezing this rag out, Anything else? Any comments, encouragements from this prayer?
I don't know how it renders it in the Hebrew, of course, but please Please deliver.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And there's where we haven't said that yet. He just asks, right? He just asks God. He makes a request. But buried under all this praise to God first.
Recognition, acknowledgement.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
It's not just a selfish, save me, but he talks about mothers with the children,
Yeah,
worried about his kingdom.
yeah. The 4 mamas that are with him. Yeah, the promise he references is in chapter 31, verse 3. Then Yahweh said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. So he's clearly referring back to that when he says in verse 9, O Yahweh, you said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. So, lots of lessons. You could go in the route of the order of his prayer. That's a good lesson, right? Start with God, see yourself rightly, give thanks, set forth your request, stand fast on the promises of God, those kind of things. That's good. But then also just the kinds of things he prays, all those, And do you have something else to hang up?
I'm just thinking, when you look at Jacob's life, you think about application or our own life, right? Everything that Jacob did before was something about him. He was going to fix it. He was in control. He was all about him.
Yeah.
And just to see the maturity and the growth in his own understanding of who God is and his relationship with God is such an encouragement, even with their own spiritual walk.
Yeah.
Because everything is about God. It's about his sovereignty. It's about speaking. It's about listening. It's about following. It's about obeying. Right? It's about the things that we should all be striving forward to, because we can become very selfish. Because if you look at it the other way, the only reason he's praying is because he's afraid of dying.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And he had fear of dying before that,
Mm-hmm.
and you didn't see that same part that Jacob would just see now.
Yeah. Jacob's life is I think this section is probably skipped if you picked one, and just because love Abraham, all the stuff, and then Joseph, we love Joseph. And of course, the beginning, 11 chapters, all the beginning stuff. This is a section that's like, if there were one that was, it would be, but Jacob is so interesting because he's a wreck, he's a mess, and the Lord just works on him. And it's such a journey, and he's still not exactly there yet. And even after this chapter, he's going to have some more shenanigans, but by the end of the story, he's going to come to realize that, as one person says, though Jacob schemes, God redeems, and he recognizes that. But, and we're not going to get to this last section, but we see just his going to the right place. He turns to the Lord. Let's wrap this up here in this final. There's so much good stuff there. I mean, you should just collect passages in the Bible that are about prayer, right? Like this one, Daniel 9, and Daniel's prayer, Paul's prayers in Colossians and Philippians and, Ephesians, and just collect these prayers and you can use them. They're really good to have and of course, the Psalms are like a big prayer book as well, but there's some really explicit, 1 Kings 8 is the dedication of the temple, and Solomon, great prayer there. It's probably the longest prayer in the Bible. And just collect these and be like, yeah, these are, start to see patterns in them. It's a great study to do. Anyway, so a lot of good stuff to see there. Notice finally, and this is kind of a sharp point on my part, there are some commentators who defend Jacob in this last part, and they're like, oh, he's just being, prudent and just making a plan. It's good to make plans, and I agree, it's good to make plans after you pray. But I think there's something going on here. And so I call this, for shock value, the atheism we often practice. The atheism, because this is a practical atheism that I think you see in Jacob's life. And Stephen Charnock in his book, The Existence of Attributes of God and Attributes of God, you're like, at least me, I'm like, okay, I've studied a lot of apologetic stuff, and I just want to get to the attributes of God part. I was like, but I'll start the existence part, and I believe God exists. And you open in like the first pages, he's like talking about practical atheism, and he slays you. He's like, you believe in God, but do you act like it. And you're like, oh, he's like killing you with, the practical atheism stuff. And that's kind of what happens with Jacob, I think, here, is that he comes off this incredible prayer, and then, verse 13, so he stayed there that night, and from what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau. And then it lists all these things. This massive amount of gifts that he gives. It's an insane amount of wealth. But the emphasis, like we said, is upon the face. And I think the point the text is trying to draw out for us is that he fears the face of Esau. He fears the face of Esau. He's motivated by his fear and his guilt. And planning is not wrong, but here he goes from praying and trusting the Lord to then trying to scheme again to trying to make this work out in his favor. And then, of course, it culminates in verses 20 to 21. Moreover, your servant, and he staggers them, right? He's like, all this wealth, and he's like, okay, first you go and you say this. And then once, it's almost like the reverse of Job in his experience. Like the servant comes and he's like, all this is lost. And then before they can finish, the next one comes. And he's like, this is lost too. And then the next one comes. But this is like all this stuff. And he's like, whoa, where's this come from? Oh, it's from Jacob, your servant. And then the next one comes, he's like, hey, I got a bunch of stuff too. And people are like, oh, is he trying to like slow Esau down? Because now he's got all this stuff he's got to carry, We used to have to travel to do like holidays and stuff. And we get presents for the kids. And we're like, we're going to put all this stuff. We got to fly on the airplane back home. We got all this stuff. And what do we do? And you're going through the airport. And that's kind of maybe what's happening as well. He's trying to slow him down, but also, butter him up for what's about to happen. But the point is, he is trying to appease him. He's trying to appease his face and hope that he will lift up his face, kind of a Hebrew idiom. And so he stays there that night waiting to see if this will work. And I think he's just kind of living as if God isn't there. He's trying to make it happen on his own. And so this will then result in God having to break him, It's like Ivan Drago in Rocky. I must break you, And God is going to break him in this final section where he is going to make Jacob see that he cannot rely upon himself and that he will forever have to be reminded that he depends upon God as he limps for the rest of his life. So, what delivers from the fear of man? Well, you fight fear with fear. And you fight fear with the fear of God. And this emphasis on the face, he's so concerned about the face of Esau. The face of Esau is in front of his face. And the text is going to emphasize verse 30, for I have seen, he calls the place Peniel, saying, for I've seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. So Esau is not your biggest problem. God is your biggest problem. And so this is all before he actually meets Esau. So God is preparing him to see the face of God, to be afraid of God, have this fear of God in the right sense that prepares him then to face his fear of his brother Esau. So there is the first half of the chapter. We'll look at the rest next time. Let me pray. Father, thank you for our time, for this chapter, for the life of Jacob. And we learned so much about you primarily, and then, of course, about the life of faith and through the life of Jacob. And we're thankful for just especially the prayer here that we glean so much from. Help us, Lord, to approach you with such candor and gratitude and acknowledgement of who you are, bringing our requests. And Lord, help us to stay there after we finish praying, staying, trusting in you. And Lord, thank you for your forgiveness when we so often fear the circumstances around us and what often never takes place. Remind us time and again, Lord, of your promises, of your word. Give us assurance of your presence. And we pray that in having that, we would be as bold as a lion, as the Proverbs say. The righteous are as bold as a lion, for you are for us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right.